Okay, next on the next class of models, cheap talk models. Um, well, I remember fairly well when I started to read a little bit into this literature. Yeah, some years ago, I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed by this unraveling argument. Yeah, I always felt that, from my institutional background in accounting, that verifiability of accounting information is always problematic, and that firms have such strong incentives to withhold information, and that they can maybe cheat, yeah, so that they just report wrong, data. So I'm not as skeptical as about this as I was as a student, I have to say, also based on the work that we've done. But in principle, I think it's fair to assume that not always information is instantly trustworthy when it's being disclosed, right? So, and this is, of course, let's say, a limitation of the unraveling class of models, where you say, okay, how can you actually make sure that information can be trusted, that information is correct? And now we take this argument to the extreme and assume that, well, let's assume that there's absolutely no way in verifying this information. So the firm can actually lie. Yeah, so they can lie, and they can tell us whatever they want. Yeah, so of course we have a little bit more structure, but in principle, this is the idea of cheap talk models. And so the general idea is, the question is then, well, can there be any value in these non-verifiable disclosures? So, and the intuition here, so I think everything in us forces us to say, well, no, not really, right? So if the firms can tell whatever they want, so why wouldn't they lie? And why wouldn't they, just cheat on us? And so there are the two videos. So this video and the next video is actually about why there can be value. But the next video is the relatively easy answer. So maybe the signal sending is costly, and we can learn something from the costs. But here we are in cheap talk. So meaning that here information is actually available free of cost. So it really becomes a question on, well, could there be any value? And then when you start to read into the cheap talk models, something like Crawford Sobel as a classic in micro, so you think that, well, yes, they can, but only if objectives are aligned. So objectives of the sender and receiver. And so when I first read this, I said, oh, big news, right? So now if the objectives are aligned, then we don't have a information asymmetry problem to begin with, and then there is no real reason for communication even. So if the objectives are completely aligned, we can simply say, okay, manager, do whatever you want, because your objectives are my objectives, everything fine, right? So in principle, the first intuition of this is to say, okay, cheap talk is not really relevant in our setting, because in our setting, we often have to fight with misaligned incentives or objectives, right? So now we could say, okay, now let's stop this video here, because cheap talk doesn't matter to our field. Well, that's not correct. Matter of factly, cheap talk models can be very interesting, and what comes up now is an attempt to actually use one of my favorite cheap talk models in a very, very simplified version to show you the intuition why cheap talk can actually be really interesting, even if incentives are at first glance not aligned. Okay, so now the setting of the Giggler 94 paper in JAR is a firm, and the firm is facing competition, Cournot type competition on the production market. So Cournot type is a competition over quantities, so meaning that the amount of units that we produce will in the end also affect the price that we are able to sell off these units. And since we are in a Cournot competition, meaning that what the competitor does matters to us. So if the competitor produces a lot, then this will increase aggregate supply and will reduce prices. And if we produce a lot, so you're getting the idea, right? So now this lucky firm, has private information about demand. So it has some information that is correct, but unfortunately, whether it's unfortunately or not, we can see, the firm has not, there is no way for the firm to verifiably communicate this information. So they can communicate the demand that they see, okay, but they don't, if they communicate this, the other side cannot be sure whether it's correct or not. So they can lie, And now let's focus first on the setting with the competitor. So would they provide information to the competitor, and would the competitor act on the disclosure? I think this is an interesting question. And in the original Giggler paper, this is a very smart paper that has a fine math. I'm not a math expert. I'm always struggling with the math, but I think I get the idea, and it is also relatively elegant how they solve it in a relatively general case. Here for this presentation, I'm butchering it down to a very, very simplistic variant, glossing over some of the details. Here I move this to a two-state problem here. So the firm observes demand, and the demand can be low or high. Yeah, so just two states. In the original Giggler paper, there's much less structure, so meaning that it's much more general than what I do here. But I think in order to communicate the main intuition, there's nothing wrong with focusing on these two stages. Okay, so now the advantage of doing two stages now is that I can actually use with game trees, and I can make it a little bit more visual, right? So now here is our game tree for the competitor game. So, so I have nature moving first. So nature simply decides on the type of demand, whether it's low or high. Okay, and then the firm has to decide whether, so the firm learns the type, right? So whether it's high or low demand. And then the firm has to decide what to disclose. Yeah, technically also, yeah, another limitation of what I do here. Technically also the firm could decide not to disclose at all, right? Not to say anything. Here I focus on the decisions the firm actually discloses. But bear with me, towards the end you will see that what I show here is also some equilibrium, so meaning that talking is an equilibrium here in this case. But here, as I said, so I try to keep things simple. So the firm has to decide what to disclose, whether low or high demand. So they can lie, right? So even in the arm to the right where demand is actually high, they can still disclose low demand. And then the competitor has to decide on whether it wants to produce high quantity or low quantity. Yeah. So and the numbers here are, I just made up some numbers so that I can make a point later on. But you can also think about these numbers as useful examples. So, for example, when the demand is low, so to your left, you first see the numbers for both the firm, which is given first, and the competitor, which is given second, are of course lower because, low demand, right? So we don't make that much profit. And then, especially if they coordinate both on producing low, so the firm will always produce the efficient quantity, obviously, because they have perfect information. The competitor has to decide, but if the competitor decides also to produce low, so low quantities, then this is good because both make a little bit of a profit here, 5. Now, if the competitor decides to produce high quantity, then this is bad for the competitor because he has to sell all these products at a lower price, and they will make a loss. Yeah. So whereas for us, it's also not good that the competitor produces high quantity because it also dampens our price. But since we are only producing low quantity because we know that demand is low, we don't make that much of a loss. We make a zero, right? And so that way you can go through all the other cells and understand the numbers. Obviously, in the next treatment, so when I communicate, demand is high, and then the competitor reacts, nothing changes because still the demand is low, although I lied and said demand is high, so meaning the payoff is exactly the same. And now when we move to the right arm where demand is high, so we are in the good state from the perspective of the firm, there's no money to be made, so now it's 20 to be made here. So, and you see that the firm here can decide to disclose high or low again, and if we disclose high and the competitor also decides to produce high quantities, then we have an equal share. Yeah, so both gets 10. If we produce low, the competitor, then this is great for us because then we actually benefit from the higher price and we get 15, and the competitor gets a little bit less because they only produce low quantities. So strategies are relatively straightforward here. So the competitor would like to produce low quantity in low demand and high quantity in high demand. That will be dominant. Unfortunately for the competitor cannot observe the demand. So the competitor can decide to act on our signal. But we see here that our strategy is obvious. We always want to convince the competitor to produce low quantity. So we would always signal low demand, because this is better for us in either case. So signaling high demand would be pointless to us because, well, in the low demand setting, if our competitor believes us, that is bad for us, and in the high demand setting is also bad for us. So we would have a strong incentive to report low demand regardless, and of course the competitor, also having rational expectations, would foresee that and would simply ignore our signal. So here in this case, the equilibrium maybe would be, it's one equilibrium, right, to disclose low, and the competitor would simply base his decision whether to produce low or high quantity on the level of risk aversion, you see when it produces low quantity, it can make it makes 5 in each case, if I see that correctly. Yes, because simply we will always produce the right quantities. So whereas if the competitor produces high quantity, then there is a likelihood of the competitor making -5 or +10. Again, more risky, right? So whether the competitor or not produces low or high isn't really the key issue here. In the later stage, we assume that the competitor will produce low quantities if receiving a low signal. But anyhow, the important takeaway here is that information doesn't really work, right? So there's no way that we can communicate. We would like to cheat with the competitor, but the competitor wouldn't buy into it. By the way, if you think about what these dotted lines are, then A, you should go to a microcourse, and B, the dotted lines indicate that the competitor cannot disentangle these states. They're connected, right? So they don't know whether nature has provided high or low demand. Okay, good. So you see, well, cheap talk, incentives are not aligned, no point in communication here. Okay, so now let's extend this problem a little bit, and we now introduce a second problem of this poor firm. So this poor firm doesn't only have a competitor, it also has a capital market, and it needs the capital market to finance production. So what the firm needs to do now, it needs to sell a part of itself, so a part of the firm, to the capital market in order to finance production. And the capital market is not a strategic player in a clear sense, but the capital market is just a rational pricing machine and prices the firm based on expectations, conditional on the information that it receives, right? But it's not behaving strategically in a clear way. So now, would the firm disclose information to the capital market, and would the market react on this information? Second problem, we look at it in isolation. Okay, so in isolation, now we have a game tree that is a little bit simpler, simply because the market doesn't move technically, but just decides. Okay, so again, nature decides on demand, can be low or high, and then we have to decide what to disclose, and the capital market will set the required share. So in principle, the capital market will demand a lower share when demand is high, simply because the value of the firm increases. So the financing, whatever we need, requires a smaller stake of the firm because the value of the firm is larger, right? So that the stake is lower then. Okay, and on the other side, if the demand is low, then in order to finance production, we need to give away more of the firm. So here, again, I just picked numbers, 20% and 50%. And now we can think about what we would like the market to believe. Obviously, we would like the market to believe that demand is high, because then we would get a higher price for our shares, so we wouldn't have to sell that many shares. So we would have a strong demand, a strong incentive to convince the market that demand is high, regardless of where it actually is. And since the market is rational and foresees this, there's no point that the market will buy into our disclosure in isolation. So because here, if the market would do that, then the market would be easily fooled. We would say, okay, demand is high, the market would give us 20%, and then we'd say thank you if the demand is low. Okay, so now this won't work. So again, we have a cheap talk setting, tough luck, no value in information. Now, obviously, there needs to be a trick, and the trick is coming up. So if you want to figure out the trick yourself, stop me here, think about it. And also you can even, I prepped the numbers for a reason, so you can actually do a little bit of calculations here if you want. Otherwise, you can also look in the Giggler paper, in the original paper. You will see the different way that he models this compared to this simplified setup. But it should give you the same idea. And then I will I will provide a solution. So here it is, the solution. Well, now we are putting this together, and we actually look at the strategy in combination of the firm. So to understand the table, you have to think about what are the options that our firm has. So the firm has actually, the only decision that this firm makes, which is problematic or which is harder, is the disclosure information. So what to disclose. Because the firm has perfect information on demand, so the firm will always make efficient choices. Yeah, so what is harder though is to actually pick the right strategy. And here I'm doing a little bit of a horse trick to keep this simple. So I'm simply assuming that our competitor and the capital market will trust our disclosure. Although I said that they won't, but now I believe that I simply assume that they will. And now I want to show you that there is an equilibrium where also the firm will truthfully disclose, and that this equilibrium is actually stable in a Nash way because nobody has an incentive actually to deviate from this decision. Okay, so now to do this, I simply compare the strategies that the firm has. So the firm has 4 different strategies. The first strategy is here in the second column, basically, to tell the truth. So when the demand is low, I disclose low. When the demand is high, I disclose high. The next strategy would be to always disclose low. Yeah. So regardless of whether demand is high or low, I will always disclose low. The third then is always disclose high, right? So if the demand is low, high, and you're getting the idea. And the fourth is a little bit esoteric, but still it's there. I could always report the opposite, right? So if there is low demand, I will provide high disclosure, and if there's high demand, I will provide low disclosure. Yeah, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, but still is a strategy, and we have to compare, let's say, the expected profits from these strategies to see whether we want to deviate from one strategy to the other. So now, I hope you get the idea on how this all works. So now we have 2 offsetting incentives here. So we've seen that for the competitor, we would always like to disclose low demand, simply so that the competitor produces low quantities and we can get a larger slice of the cake. For the capital market, we would always like to disclose high demand, simply because this will get a higher price and we have to forgo a lower share of the firm, right? So these 2 nicely offset each other in these numerical conditions, not always, but there's in the Giggler paper, you can see that there's a wider range of conditions where actually this offsetting takes place. So what you see here, for example, when you look at the first strategy, you see that the first strategy has the highest expected payoff to the owner. And this is why the owner would have an incentive to pick the truth-telling strategy. Yeah, and this is then also depending on the others having the incentive to actually believe in this, and then you would have a Nash where nobody would have an incentive to deviate, right? So, and this is exactly an informative, cheap topping equilibrium. So, how do we get these numbers? Yeah, it's simply the calculation based on the demands. And we assume here that both demands are equally likely. Yeah. So and then you see that based on the actual disclosure that the firm makes, you have different values that they have to, or percentages that they have to distribute to the capital market. So in the truth telling, it really depends on what they communicate. So 50% when they communicate low demand, 20% when they communicate high demand. Yeah, and then if they always disclose low, then obviously because the other firms are actually believing now, so they will always get 50%. So this is bad. Yeah, but on the same time, they would have higher payoffs, right? So that will be good. Yeah, so and so you can calculate, for example, for the always low demand. So this is the average of 5 and 15. So equally weighted. Yeah. So that will be 10, and out of these 10, they can pocket 50%. So that will be 5. Yeah. Whereas if they provide truth-telling information, yeah, then in the case of low demand, they would get only 2.5. Yeah, that's not too much. Yeah, but in the case of high demand, they would get 20%, 80% out of 10. That's 8. Yeah, so and that's taken together. Yeah, it's 10.5 over 2, 5.252. So that means 5.25. Sorry, and that means actually telling the truth is better than always reporting low demand here. And you can do the same calculation for always communicating high demand, which would be great for the capital market end because you only have to pay 20% regardless. But then again, of course, the high demand would actually convince the competitor to join, right? Tough luck. And so this means that you would get lower payoffs, right? Because of that. Yeah, and the opposite. So the opposite strategy doesn't make any sense. And obviously, it's also the one with the lowest payoff. So now what you see here in this little video is you see that how cheap talk. So information that cannot be verified can still be informative to market participants, even in settings where there is no obvious matching of incentives and objectives, right? So here we have a relatively realistic setting with two competing objectives. So the firm would like to look bad to competitors but good to the capital market, and in combination this generates relatively strong incentives for truth telling. Yeah? And this is interesting. I like that, right? So it tells us something about how these incentives can interact, and I think this is really important to understand and to think about more strategically. So now also in a world where corporations face multiple incentives from various parties, I think what the Gigler paper tells us and the cheap talk literature tells us is that we have to think about the incentives in combination. Yeah, even if, let's say, the single incentives might be screwed, in combination, all these different interactions can actually create relatively robust incentives to be truth-telling. Okay, so I think this is really, I like it. Did I say it? I like it. I like the paper. I like the way that the intuition works. And it tells us that verification is important, but even without verification, informative disclosures can happen. Okay, thanks. Next video coming up, signaling. Now it's becoming costly. Okay, see you there.